The 80s in New York City, a time of bright colors, shoulder pads, big hair, and the genesis of MTV and hip-hop. But ravishing through the underbelly of the city that never sleeps was a mysterious disease prevalent in gay men, silently wiping out a community. AIDS, it was later named, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, is a set of sometimes fatal symptoms that comes from untreated HIV, also known as human immunodeficiency virus. When the gay community in New York turned to the government for help during this time and were ignored, they decided to fight for themselves and bring this deadly illness to the forefront of American culture to raise awareness and develop treatments. These fighters were those most affected by HIV/AIDS, including many artists and performers such as Keith Haring. Keith Haring was an underground graffiti artist turned international superstar who was prevalent in New York City during the 1980s. In response to President Ronald Reagan's intentional inaction on the AIDS epidemic charged by homophobia, society's changing detrimental views on the gay community, and false information being spread about AIDS, Haring used his artwork to bring attention to the AIDS epidemic. Haring broke barriers through his artwork to make AIDS a serious issue in the public's eye, which led to more activism and eventually efforts to actively address the AIDS crisis. Keith Haring was born in Kutztown, Pennsylvania in 1958. He developed a deep love for art at a young age, and his family was supportive of his artistic desires and career. Haring moved to New York City in 1978 to develop his art further, where he attended the School of Visual Arts. Haring started his art career as a graffiti artist. He would go to the subway stations and would draw images in chalk on the empty advertisement spaces on the walls. Haring was often arrested for doing this, but his underground artwork was well known throughout the city. After only 5 years in New York, Haring's career took off. He was creating murals all over the world, holding exhibitions, and he had installations at some of the most well-known museums. Haring's art was everywhere. Anti-drug campaigns, t-shirts, Absolute vodka labels, and even a carousel in Hamburg. Haring was one of the biggest artists in the world at the peak of his career. The first reports of AIDS were on June 5, 1981, in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. The report said that 4 gay men from California had died from pneumonia, a rarely deadly illness, and it had been reported that their immune systems had been completely weakened. The mysterious illness was quickly named GRID, Gay-Related Immune Disease. By the end of 1981, 121 men had died from this mysterious disease that somehow caused pneumonia and, now, Kaposi's sarcoma, a skin cancer. The disease got its current name, AIDS, a year later, in September of 1982, and 2 years later, the HIV virus causing AIDS was found. HIV is a virus that never goes away. When someone is HIV positive, they have HIV for life. HIV infects and kills T cells, which are white blood cells that fight off cancer and infections. Without T cells, the body's immune system is left vulnerable to illness. In 1987, there were 47,022 reported cases of AIDS in the United States. By the end of the decade, in 1989, 100,000 people had been reported with AIDS and over 27,000 people had died from AIDS. In 1992, AIDS was the #1 cause of death in the United States for men aged 25 to 44. Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, near the early days of the AIDS outbreak in the United States. Reagan was a conservative Republican who many voters hoped would shift the United States back to its traditional values and morals. President Reagan had a very conservative administration, many who believed AIDS was a plague sent by God to punish gay people for sinning. This belief trickled down to the people, and according to a study by the New England Journal of Medicine in 1988, some 8 to 60% of persons surveyed considered AIDS to be God's punishment for immoral sexual behavior. Reagan's administration, at times, responded to the deaths of thousands of Americans with a lackadaisical and jovial attitude. The following audio is from a White House press briefing on October 12, 1984. The conversation is between the press secretary, Larry Speaks, and a journalist, Lester Kinsolving.
It's known as gay plague. No, it is. I mean, it's a pretty serious thing that 1 in every 3 people that get this have died, and I wondered if the president is aware of it.
I don't have it, are you? Do you?
You don't have it. Well, I'm relieved to hear that, Larry.
Do you?
You don't.
You didn't answer my question.
Well, I just wondered,
how do you know?
Does the president, in other words, the White House looks on this as a great joke?
No, I don't know anything about it, Lester.
Virginia Apuzzo, the executive director of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, demanded for meetings to occur between the government and AIDS activists to discuss the crisis. However, these meetings took place between conservative activists and the Reagan administration, and those affected most by HIV/AIDS were not allowed to participate in these important conversations. The Surgeon General under President Reagan was C. Everett Koop. Until the mid-1980s, Koop was stopped by Reagan and his advisors to make any progress, fund any grants, or do anything at all that had to do with the AIDS crisis. Koop published the administration's first report on AIDS on October 22, 1986, half a decade after the crisis started. The rise of Keith Haring, the breakout of the AIDS epidemic in New York, and Reagan's ignorance to the issue all culminated in the 1980s. Haring was a gay man living in New York. When AIDS started ravishing through the gay community, Haring saw the atrocity of the disease up close. Additionally, the AIDS epidemic came at a pivotal time for gay rights in the United States. During the 1970s, homosexuality was becoming slightly less taboo and more accepted than ever before in American history. However, the AIDS epidemic seemed to revert America, as many people, due to misinformation and a lack of education, were scared to even interact with any gay people out of fear of contracting AIDS. Additionally, Reagan's conservative presidency and policies increased the amount of stigma against the gay community. Because of all that was happening, the gay community in New York was very upset, confused, and terrified about what was going to happen to them. The country was ignoring and abandoning them as they were dying, and they felt lost and alone. Haring heard the people and responded the only way he knew how to, through his art. Haring used his art to deal with the AIDS crisis. He promoted safe sex, called out Reagan's inaction, personified the virus, and deterred people away from using drugs involving needles. More importantly, he brought his art to the forefront of American culture and society. He strived to make AIDS a conversation that was had between people. Silence Equals Death is a Haring print made in 1989. The pink triangle is a reappropriation of what the Nazis used to distinguish homosexuals during the Holocaust. Haring used this triangle to call out the ignorance of the American people and government during the AIDS epidemic. Fight AIDS Worldwide is a print made by Haring in 1990. The smaller bodies represent all those who have died of HIV/AIDS, and the larger body represents the world. This piece is promoting everybody taking on the burden of the disease and fighting for an end. Ignorance Equals Fear is probably Haring's most famous AIDS artwork. Created in 1989, the three figures represent the Reagan administration's ignorance of the crisis and all the deaths, and the messages above and below the figures are calls to action to be active in the fight. After years of seeing his friends suffer and eventually die from AIDS-related illnesses, Haring was diagnosed with HIV in 1988 when he was only 30. However, Haring did not let being HIV positive deter him from his true passion in life, art. Haring started developing lesions, which come with Kaposi sarcoma. In his last 2 years of life, Haring made some of his most intricate and advanced works of his career. Keith Haring died on February 16, 1990. The first drug to treat HIV/AIDS was AZT, which slowed down the progression of the disease. AZT was not very practical because it had to be taken extremely often. In 1996, there was a major improvement in medications fighting HIV/AIDS when highly active antiretroviral therapy was created. This decreased the chances of dying from AIDS-related illnesses astronomically, and the amount of AIDS-related illnesses and hospitalizations decreased by 60 to 80%, as well as, for the first time since 1981, the number of deaths caused by AIDS decreased. In 1993, 15,000 New Yorkers were diagnosed with HIV. In 2012, that number dropped down to 3,400. Haring led a wave of activism and outrage from many Americans who were extremely upset and disappointed about the government's response to AIDS. Through the work of Haring and other activists, new medicines were created to treat HIV/AIDS. In a time where no one else was fighting for them, the gay community came together and fought for visibility and change. Keith Haring was a true barrier breaker who helped change the face of activism during the AIDS crisis. The gay community and the world alike are forever grateful for Haring's efforts. He is a true American hero.